Hey guys, welcome back. So sorry it's been a little while. It's busy as per usual. You can see behind me I'm actually building a boat for a prop in an indie film. So I've been working on this all week. But we're not going to be talking about that today. We'll cover that in another video. I've been taking time lapse of that whole build. Right now we are going to take one of these Rolls Royce Derwent jet engine combustor liners that I have meticulously copied. And we are going to open it all up, cut out all the holes, and make it look like a real thing. I'm not going to go for the IG-88 thing. I am just going to make it look metal and weathered and set it up so it looks like a real one. And then it, could go in the Landspeeder or the Cantina or any of these places. Now this was one of the castings I was about to send out to somebody, and I realized there's a little flub in it right here, and I had not priced it as a B casting. So we're going to fix it all up, and maybe I'll sell it when I'm done. I don't know. We'll check at the end of the video. But to start with, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start drilling out all of the holes. And what I'm using is this Dremel with these little grinding bits. I've got a whole bunch of these. They come in a pack from Harbor Freight. I've had them for probably 8 years now, and they've lasted a long time. They cost me maybe like $7 or $8. I've got some more of them. They have different shapes, so you have pointed bits and then little flat bits, not flat but cylindrical I should say, a whole bunch of different shapes, and I'll primarily be using those to do all the cutting here, and it's gonna be awesome. So without further ado, let's get to work. So what I've done here is I've gone ahead and I basically started all of the holes with a pointed bit. Now this is just to get a hole started so that when I switch bits it's a little easier to continue along here. Now one thing, if you guys, I don't know if somebody has bought one of these from myself or from Scott Will, who also sells these canisters, the combustor liners. On the inside here, on the real part, there's you can see these weld lines around here. Now on the inside there's a metal strip that these pieces of metal would be welded to. So these little grooves don't open all the way through to the inside. The holes are open, and the groove continues maybe 1/8 of an inch up, and then behind that it's just metal. So the groove doesn't go all the way up. And basically on my castings I haven't tried to fill in any of those. It's the same up here as well. Like this piece of metal goes up on the inside, and then these grooves are not open all the way down. It's just a hole with maybe a slight opening partially into that groove, but outside of that, not so much. Here's what I'm after. So it's a cylindrical little grinder. It's small enough to get into most of the holes here that I'm going to be working on, but big enough that it'll make okay progress on this. So let's get back to it. All right, so let me take this off here. Look like I've been making cocaine. So I've got all the holes drilled out. You may have seen I switched to, hang on, woo! You may have seen I switched to a larger grinding bit to clean out the larger holes. Just the larger diameter makes a cleaner surface on the inside of the holes. So the holes are all drilled now, which is really nice. Now we're going to go in and I'm going to clean up these seam lines here. Next what I'm going to do is clean up the seam line, which is it's pretty subtle on these things. Every once in a while, if I squeeze the mold too tight, I'll get a little offset right at the very bottom, which on the newer ones, I don't think it does that so much because I've put a little spacer in my mold to make sure it doesn't squeeze too tight. But basically what I do to get rid of this seam line, it's pretty, like I said, it's pretty subtle. God, my nails are dirty. I use a razor like this, and I just hold it perpendicular to the surface just basically straight on, and then sort of drag it along that seam line, and it will take off all the excess flashing and level it out really, really nice. So it looks like I'm scraping a lot, but it's just barely taking off anything on the surface, and it will make that seam line pretty much vanish. And especially once we do the next step, I mean, you can see a little mark where the razor was, but the seam line it's basically smooth. And I just go in and make sure that any little pieces of flashing that are in the details here are gone. Just sort of drag the razor so that seam line is vanished. And basically I'll chase this around the whole piece. Won't take but maybe 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll be back for the next step. So I have scraped off the seam lines with the razor. You can see a little mark there, but you don't really feel anything. It's basically smooth. But I am going to go over this really quickly with some 600 grit sandpaper, and I'm going to wet sand it down just to make sure it's super even. I'm going to get some water here. This is not Windex, it's just water. This little spritzer is kind of jangy right now, so kind of works. And just hit it with the sandpaper, and we go over this whole thing. And there's one little bump that I mentioned at the top previously, right here. It's hard to see it. Get the angle right, you can kind of see it right there. Probably going to sand that down and then hit this with the 600 as well. Now the reason I'm doing the 600 is that it doesn't really show up too much. Like where the seam line is, it'll really super even that out, so you don't have to worry about it. But it also will take off any little surface coating that's on there without putting a lot of texture. And that way, on the next step, when we prime this thing, we'll have a nice smooth surface to adhere to, so you won't get a bunch of weird little lines to fix and so forth. Because we're going to use a pretty thin primer. We're not going to use a filler primer or any of that. I don't want to hide any detail. I just want to put one little layer of primer on here to give us something to work off of when we get to the Alclad stage. So I'm going to continue sanding here. Again, I'm just going over like these lines and evening them out so you don't really see any marks there. Just takes a few seconds on each one, not a big deal. But I am running this over the whole thing, like I mentioned. So we'll be back momentarily. Okay, so we have now sanded all the seam lines real nice. It's very smooth. And I did a little patch up here. There was some kind of weird, something got in the mold, and there was like a bubble of stuff. And I scraped it out, and it was encapsulated on the back. So all I had to do was remove it, and then I filled it with a little bit of Bondo and resanded it. Now if I close my eyes, I can't even feel where that is, which is good. So that's nice and smooth. Now we are going to prime this. So with the primers that I use, these are the typical ones I use. I use one of the Rust-Oleums. These are pretty common, and Krylon. I typically prefer the Krylon primer a little more, but I do use both. These are thicker. They go on a lot thicker, and they're a little bit higher build, which is kind of good if I'm doing like a big 3D printed part with like simple shapes. This stuff is great because it just fills in everything really quickly. But I don't like to use it for stuff with little details. Like this has all these little, I don't know if you can see this, but there's like tiny little weld marks and all this stuff on here that I don't want to fill in. So I'm going to use the Krylon primer, which is much finer and leaves a really thin coat so that you don't lose all the detail, and I like that. The color is nice, and it dries really fast, so we'll be able to work pretty quickly. If you're not used to using spray paints, I would say one of the big things is don't just shake it. Let's see, shake it a lot, especially primers. Especially like the Rust-Oleum primers are typically a little thicker. Shake it a lot, like almost a minute. Shake it hard. If you can do it to where, I don't know if you can see this, but the little bead inside, if you shake it hard enough to put little dents in the bottom, then see the little dents? You're probably doing it right. And those little dents are from that little agitator inside. Now, as you spray, be sure to shake often. And one thing I like to do is I don't just spray these big long coats. I dust it nice and thin. It's a little windy today, which is not helping me out very much here, but I will dust it just nice and thin like this. knock down a little bit of a basic coat. And one thing, especially on resin parts, why this is good is that if you have an area where you might have a little bit of mold release that you've missed or anything, if you pound on a whole bunch of paint, you'll get these little fish eyes really bad. But if you dust it, give it, you know, a few minutes to sort of kick off between passes, you're less likely to get those. And I find that you get a better, more even coat. So especially with one like this, if you did this kind of spraying with the Rust-Oleum, you're likely to get like little boogers on the surface. But the Krylon goes on so thin that it usually doesn't do that. This is the same paint that I used when I was working on the Regal Robot Millennium Falcon model. It was a 3D printed model that they used on their asteroid table. And I had to paint multiple layers of primer onto this really, really detailed model. I did not want to lose any of that detail. So this is what I used. And even with 2 or 3 passes of this, the detail was preserved. It didn't fill in all the little spaces and soften all the little corners and everything, which is good. Now one thing on this is that inside of this part is white, which I think maybe on future castings I'll try to cast it with a darker material inside, but I will probably just poke a spray paint can inside the holes and try to just get the inside like a dark color, maybe just hit it with black. I'm going to do 2 coats, just like I'm doing now. I'll do one, let it dry for maybe like 5-10 minutes, and then go back and do another one. And then we will hit the next step. Alright guys, so it's been a few hours since I painted this thing. It is all primed up and ready to rock. You can see that because the paint is nice and thin, you can still see all the weld lines and all the little details are still there. Not a problem. Didn't fill any of that in, which is good. It's what we wanted. But there is just a slightest little texture on the surface, very, very subtle. But I'm going to hit this with some 600 grit sandpaper, wet sand it as well. So, you know, I always like to wet sand. It just feels like it gets a better finish, less buildup on the sandpaper, so your sandpaper lasts way longer. It's good. So I'm going to wet sand this. I'm not going to sand off any details. I'm just going to smooth out all the broad surfaces so that we have a nice base to work with. Now, another thing I like about wet sanding as opposed to dry sanding is that you just go really light, real gentle, and as soon as that surface texture is gone, the sandpaper kind of glides across the surface. It's a very tactile thing that I like. It doesn't take very much. Again, I'm going real light here. And you can just feel as once it gets that little surface grit off, the sandpaper just coasts around on that layer of water. Real easy. And I like that. It's a very good way to tell when you're getting it smooth without over sanding. Good thing. So another trick here with wet sanding, I don't know if I'm able to get this, is you can see like how the water will cling to the surface where it's been sanded. So it kind of stays on here, but it will bead up like here in areas where it hasn't been sanded, which is a good trick to tell what you sanded, what you haven't, if the surface is pretty smooth already. So the sanding is done, it is still wet, and it's ready for the final step, which if you've seen any of the Alclad videos I did a long time ago, probably almost 5 years ago, I used car polish on the surface to get a nice shine, which is going to really help when we hit the Alclad stage. So this is what I'm doing now. Just put a little bit on a paper towel. Paper towel is damp. This is the same one I used to dry off the surface. And I just go over all the surfaces and kind of buff it. And this will basically really smooth out the surface layer to, I'm not going to go fully shiny with this like I did with 3PO, but I'm going to buff it till it gets like a little bit of reflectivity, and that's going to definitely help it feel much more like real metal. So this is, you can see what I'm doing here. And as I go, it's just going to get shinier, and I will go over this whole thing with this. It's going to probably take me like 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes. Not terribly long, but I think it's worth the effort. A little bit of elbow grease here, Goes a long way. And once I'm done, we'll take a look and see what the finish looks like. Alright, so we are now back in my shop. We haven't been in here in a long time, but I've got my table set up, got some fresh paper down here, and I'm ready to shoot. And as you can see, I have put some polish on this IG-88 head, this Rolls Royce Derwent jet engine combustor liner, which I'm just going to call an IG-88 head from probably this point forward. You can see it's got some gloss to it now. Now this is done just with the primer. All I did was wet sand the primer, and then I polished it with the polishing compound that I showed earlier. That is all that has happened here. You can see it's not shiny, but it's a little glossy. Now this is kind of an in-between technique. If you've seen any of my other videos where I used the Alclad, the last one that I used the Alclad in, I did a brushed aluminum technique where I used steel wool and ran it around to give score lines, so it kind of looked like a machine part. My old videos that I did back in 2012 maybe, I did like a highly polished version. I basically did the same treatment as this, I just polished it even more, and I used a white base coat. Now this is just primer, just wet sanded and then polished again to this level. It's not super shiny, just a little bit of glossiness. And we're going to be painting this with the Alclad Chrome ALC 107 is the number. Let's see if I can get that to show up here. Focus. That's the number we're going to go for. They've changed the package a little bit, the bottle, but it's the same stuff. And we're going to be shooting this through an airbrush. We are going to put on some gloves here because the gloves are going to help keep the oils from my fingers off of the part, which will make the Alclad stick a little bit better. I have my airbrush hooked up. This is a cheap single action airbrush. You can get these at Harbor Freight for about $8 or $9. I have an airbrush compressor, but right now I'm just running this to my big compressor, which is it's like a 33-gallon Husky. And it's awesome because you don't have to listen to the compressor sound the whole time, buzzing away in the background. So this is great. That giant tank will have plenty of air for this whole project. Now with this Alclad, you definitely want to shake it a lot to make sure that those flakes are totally free, because what will happen is that they'll settle on the bottom and they'll kind of stick there. I'm going to make sure that they're all broken up. I have already given this quite a bit of shaking. And I put a little bit in the bottom, maybe a quarter. And I've only used a little bit. You can see there's quite a bit left in the jar. It's easier to add more to this than to than to pour it back in that other jar. So I just do a little bit at a time and get a little poof going here. I might have the pressure slightly high, but it's not too bad. Usually you want it to be around 15 pounds of pressure. I think it might be around 20 right now, but it'll be okay. And you want the flow of the Alclad to be very, very light so that it doesn't throw down a ton of the paint. Like right now it's probably a little bit too much. I'm going to go real light and just like light coats. Let me see if I can get this at an angle where you guys can see. It barely shows up. You just go over and over until you get it to about the consistency that you want. I don't know if you're able to see that. It's starting to look like metal right there. And it still might be a little bit much. I'm going to tighten this down even more. And if you do this really thin light coats like this, a little tiny bit of Alclad will go a very long way. And as you spray this, you get it cut, the coverage really good. It's going to look more and more metallic. And you give it a few minutes to dry, and then you hit it with something to buff it, which I'm going to use toilet paper here because it's pretty soft. You don't want your tuchus to get a rash, so you want your toilet paper to be soft unless you get like that cheap stuff. I'm only just going to grab a few sheets here and save this for later in case I need it. So where we have kind of like a metallic finish here, we're going to take this and just buff it into the surface. And I'm giving it some pressure because this is going to help it infuse with the primer. Now I find that using a cheap spray paint for this works much better than using like an automotive paint. Some guys will use automotive paints and get this super glossy finish, and the Alclad will look really, really good on there. But it's fragile. which means that you can't really handle it. Like if you see how much pressure I'm putting on there, you can see that hardly any of it's coming off on the tissue paper, and it is bonding to the surface. I just sprayed this just a few seconds ago, as you saw, and it's already, I'm able to polish it like this, and I get like a metal look. So I'm gonna go ahead and finish painting this whole thing. Now that you've seen how I'm gonna do it, I'm gonna just continue along, paint this whole piece. We'll come back and take a look, and then we will get on to doing some weathering. Alright, so now we have a nice metal looking finish, which I think looks pretty good. And it's not super polished, but it looks like a real object now. We will get to the weathering, so I'm going to go collect the paints, and I will be back with some of the colors that I will be using. I've got some paints here, some colors that might seem kind of random, but we're going to talk about this in a second. So, let's see, I got a bunch of little tubes here. These are all acrylics. You can do the same job with, you know, oil paints, or I'm watching here, I have a visiting dog, and it's trying to make its way past the tripods here, and she did it. She didn't knock anything down. Amazing. So we have all of these paints here. In this cup I've got a bunch of gross watered down black paint, which is going to be kind of where we're going to start. These are all acrylics. You can use oil paints if you want. Oil paints look really good, but they take a little longer to dry, and they kind of have like a tackiness to them that is a little much. And if you want to move them or take some off, you need a little bit of a solvent, which will potentially take off some of the Alclad. But with the acrylics, you can take them off with water. Also, another thing that'll work, this is not Windex. However, Windex, this is just water. You have water in a spray bottle. Windex, which is like ammonia-based cleaner, seems to work okay on Alclad. Alcohol-based cleaners, on the other hand, don't. They will lift off the metallic finish. So we've got our part here. It's looking really metal and cool. And we are going to start on this paint. Now, what I like to do, I'll get into these colors in a little bit, get all this stuff out of the way. I start with the watered down black, and I just start touching it into all the little details and so forth. And I have a paper towel nearby. I might just use some of this leftover tissue paper for this part. It doesn't really matter. I just need to be able to wipe some of it away. I'm going to turn on the GoPro and time-lapse this, and I'll do all the blacks here, and then I will get into the colors and discuss why I'm using what I'm using. Back in a moment. I'm using a little bit bigger brush here. I'm just really just getting this wetting down black stuff spread around anywhere where there's a crevice or a groove or a crack, and just kind of coating the surface. Now, this is going to be a little damp here, so I'm trying to work quickly before it dries too much. I'm going to take my tissue paper here, and I kind of just wipe it around, just remove as much excess as I feel looks good. I don't push hard or try to get it all off, but I basically run the rag around the surface so that it breaks it up and it leaves the dirt in the crevices. Now, with the Alclad, you can see it's kind of getting dirty. If you push a little bit, you'll actually bring back the shine of the Alclad. You can get right back through to the metal if you want, like I did here. We don't want to do that too much. We might shine it up in a few spots just to make it look like maybe it's been handled. But here, this is a good example. I'm just taking the black, running around this crease here, trying to make sure that it's in these little weld lines, and then we're going to just go over it again here with the rag, just like I did before. Now, if you can run perpendicular to your lines here, and you'll see at first I kind of started to go like this. You don't want to do that too much, because that will, if you get like a little piece of this cloth inside the groove, it'll just take the paint right out. So you're going to try to avoid that and go perpendicular to your lines, and this is going to help keep some of that dirt down in the crevices, which looks a little more natural. Keep this going here, and if it does start to dry, like I said, you can sort of buff through this. That's one good thing about using the acrylic, is it does allow you to kind of get through the surface there. So down here I've got a whole bunch of this dark stuff, and you can see if I push a little bit I can wipe it off, and it starts to just polish back up the Alclad without removing it. which is good. Now this is another one of those parts where if you were to do this on like a 2K auto body clear coat finish where it's really shiny, you'd get a very, very shiny metal finish. But if you were to push on it at all, like I'm doing now, the Alclad would come right off of the base coat, which right now you can see that it's basically staying on there. We're not losing any of the Alclad. It is really, really adhered to that primer base, which is good. Makes it easy to work with, makes the part feel realistic, and it's touchable and handleable. Handleable? Is that a word? So you can pick this thing up and then move it around or whatever, and you don't have to really worry too much about the Alclad coming off. Now if you were handling all the time, it might be a thing, but honestly it's probably easier to just touch up the Alclad if you need to, rather than coat it with something. I would recommend doing that. My C3PO, my early versions, the leg was silver, the right leg. Alclad, just raw Alclad, nothing over it. People handled the suit all the time. Whenever they had to put me in there, someone would have to put their hands all over that leg and, you know, push it around, and it never really affected the Alclad on the bottom. So I am a fan of this stuff because of that. I think that's says a lot, speaks a lot for the paint itself. And again, if you do this over like some hard enamel paint or something, it will come off much more easily. So it's a kind of a trick I've discovered that I like. So I'm wiping this down. And you can see it's starting to look more like a real thing. Which is pretty cool. Now the real part has like some dirt kind of like in these little grooves. On mine it's a used part. So it was used in an airplane. It's not a brand new one. So there's a lot of little grooves, and there's some like weird coloration to it in places. There's like some odd greens and stuff that are trapped, and then there are some other random little colors that are like mixed in with the grime. On this one, we're going to use some of these random colors to kind of give it a little more life, so it's not just dirt. And you may have seen here, I've got like a teal color, a couple of greens. I've got this like vermilion. Is this what this is? Yeah, it's just like a orangish red, which is a color I really, really like. Now, these parts are made out of like stainless steel or something, the real ones, and they don't really rust. But we could make this look like maybe it was near some other metal objects that had some rust. It'll help. It'll liven it up a little bit. Same with the yellow ochre. These two colors, this is very earthy, kind of makes it look like it's been outside or in the weather. And a little bit of this teal really helps the metal kind of feel realistic. I mean, this metal looks very realistic in person right now, and it looks pretty good on camera too. But a little bit of green on there is going to help it even more. It's going to sell it even more, which is good. So I'm going to do one last little hit here with the black. So I'm going to go back around and find spots that might have dried a little and just buff them off. Buff it back down to the metal. Definitely get the high points here. Now this green color, I'm just going to put some of this in a little cup here. Just a little bit. And you're just going to be like little spots on the surface. They just kind of help it feel a little more realistic. Now I'm going to get a paper towel. Get this a little bit wet, not a lot. Just this little damp. And get some of these greens in here. Now, first place I noticed people doing this, like it's, you know, so a lot of this is like stuff you just pay attention to things you see and try to take in the colors. But also when you see someone use the technique, you go, oh yeah, that color is in there, and it really helps to sell it. I saw some of the real Predator helmets from Aliens vs. Predator, and they had these little hints of these teal colors, just random, real subtle, and man, it really, really, really made it convincing that it was metal. And just on here now, just these little bits, I'm not even to the other colors yet, I don't know if you can see that, but it really kind of sells it. It looks real nice. So just a little bit to that here and there. It's going to help. And I'm just going to put it in some of the little ridge lines right along with the weathering. And these extra colors add so much more than just like a black wash. Like a black wash will work, but a few other colors on the piece and it really starts to feel like a thing that's been outside or had some use. So I don't want to go too crazy with these colors, just want a little bit. This color here, this teal color, works really great if you're doing brass or bronze. Works really well with those kind of colors as well. Works well with those colors as well. Good one, Gordon. So right now I'm just kind of like touching up these little, like around the weld lines and so forth. Typically I do these in the same cups, but for this we're going to mix it up. Now we're going to add our yellow. A little bit here. And if you work in layers like this, and basically I'm going to wet this down so it's pretty watery. You work in layers like this and you just add a little bit here and there until it starts to feel kind of in the range that you're after. And this stuff, just keep it real random. We don't want it to be like too colorful. It's just like little hits of odd colors on there that will help sell it. Where's our rust color? Here's our rust color. Again, I typically do these in 1 cup. I wouldn't use 3 cups, but I'm a little more haphazard. My water cup is very contaminated with black right now, so this is that rust color. It's going to be a little much here, but you can see just dropped on the floor and on my shorts at the same time. Very cool. Good job. Let's get some on there. It's really bright right now. You just tap it down and into the groove. It sort of blends in with the black and kind of looks just like, could be rust, could be some kind of paint contamination on there. It just is a little extra color just to kind of help it feel a little more real. If you ever go too heavy on these guys, you can just wipe some of it off, calm it down a little bit if you think it's too much. If you get a wet paper towel like this and tap it in so you just get like little hints of color on the surface. It takes a little trial and error and you'll start to feel it when it starts to look right. Now, you can see it's pretty subtle. Like on camera especially, it's really subtle. In person you can see a little bit better, but it's definitely feeling like a real object now, which is pretty cool. Now, as of right now, this paint job is like almost good enough to be on film. In person it looks like it could use a little more. And that's another thing to consider. If you're painting something, weathering it, are you going to use it for a film? Are you going to display it in your house or have it on a costume that people are going to see up close? If it's going to be seen up close, you may want to put a little more time into it, but you can get away with a lot on camera that you might not be able to get away with up close. So it's another thing to keep in mind. You can work pretty quickly if it's just going to be an object on screen, even if you're relatively close to it. Like when I put the camera this close, it doesn't look bad at all. But again, I feel like in person it could feel a little more realistic. So I'm going to keep going here for a moment, adding a little bit more of that black finish to it, and you can tap it or wipe it or whatever technique gets you some kind of added texture bonus. That's pretty much where it's at right now. I may go a little further with it, but for this video, I think this is a pretty good representation of what the part looks like. It looks pretty much like the real piece that I have in my living room right now. Actually, the one in my living room might be a little dirtier, so this is looking pretty good, I think, considering this is a resin part. So hopefully this was informative. If you guys have bought one of these from me and you want to paint it, hopefully this is like kind of a good tutorial. This does look pretty much like the real piece, especially on camera. Like in person it looks pretty good. On camera it looks even better. So yeah, cool, man. Thanks, guys. Cool, man. I don't know what I'm saying. Thanks again for stopping by. I will see you
soonish. Bye!
So, in this video, we are going to